What happened after Jesus died? 5 shocking signs you need to know. The story didn't end at the cross. What if I told you that the most powerful moments in history happened after Jesus took his final breath? We all know the story of the cross. We've heard of the nails, the crown of thorns, the agonizing cries. We've read about the sky turning black, the words of Jesus echoing through the air. It is finished. And then, silence. The crowds begin to leave. The religious leaders sigh in relief. His disciples, they are shattered. The Messiah, dead. Hope, buried. For 3 years they had followed him. They had seen him heal the sick, raise the dead, command the storm to be still. And yet now he was gone. It felt like the end of the story. But what no one knew at that moment, what even his closest followers didn't understand, was that the moment Jesus gave up his spirit, something shifted in the fabric of reality itself. Because while the world mourned, heaven was moving. Something happened. It started immediately. A sound tore through the temple. Loud, violent, impossible. A veil, a massive curtain that had separated God's presence from the people, was ripped in two. At the same time, the earth trembled, splitting rocks apart. Graves broke open. And in the city, people who had been dead for years suddenly walked among the living. Imagine the whispers, the confusion, the fear. What is happening? Did you hear? The temple veil is torn. They say graves have opened. People are seeing the dead alive. And in the middle of all this chaos, a Roman soldier, one of the very men who had nailed Jesus to the cross, who had mocked him just hours earlier, stood there, shaken. And with a voice full of awe and fear, he uttered the words no Roman was ever supposed to say, truly, this man was the Son of God. Something had happened, something unexplainable, something supernatural. The world thought Jesus' death was the end, but the truth, it was just the beginning. 5 events that changed everything. In the hours and days after Jesus' final breath, 5 extraordinary events took place. Events that confirmed, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that his death wasn't a defeat, it was a victory. What happened wasn't just history, it was eternity breaking into time. And today, we're going to walk through those 5 events together. By the end of this video, I promise you, you will never see the cross the same way again. Because Jesus didn't just die and rise again for himself. He did it for you. Are you ready? Let's begin. Number 1, the temple veil was torn in 2. Something happened inside the temple that no one could have expected. At the very moment Jesus breathed his last, a sound ripped through the silence. It wasn't the wailing of the crowds. It wasn't the rumbling of the earthquake. It was something far more profound. Somewhere deep inside the Temple of Jerusalem, hidden behind sacred walls where no ordinary person was allowed to enter, the veil that separated man from God was suddenly torn in 2. And not just torn, ripped violently from top to bottom. What was so special about this veil? To understand why this moment was so shocking, we have to talk about what the veil represented. This wasn't just a decorative curtain. This was the veil of the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place in all of Israel, the very place where the presence of God was believed to dwell. It was so holy that no one was allowed inside, except for one man, the high priest, and even he could only enter once a year on the Day of Atonement after strict purification rituals. And the veil? It was massive. Historians tell us it was 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, and as thick as a man's hand. It was so heavy that it would have taken hundreds of men to lift it. It was meant to be a permanent barrier, separating sinful humanity from the holiness of God. And yet, in an instant, it was torn apart, not by human hands, not from bottom to top, as if men had tried to rip it, but from top to bottom, as if heaven itself had reached down and ripped apart the division between God and man. The shock of the priests. Can you imagine what the priests inside the temple must have felt at that moment? One moment, everything is normal, the altar, the sacred lamps, the rituals they had performed for generations. And the next, a violent ripping sound, and suddenly they can see into the Holy of Holies. Something no one was ever supposed to see. For thousands of years, the veil had stood as a symbol of separation, and now it was gone. The presence of God was no longer hidden. Something had changed forever. What did this mean? The moment Jesus died on the cross, the veil was torn to show one undeniable truth. The separation between God and man was over. The old system, the need for priests, for sacrifices, for rituals, was finished because Jesus was the final sacrifice. His blood did what no animal sacrifice ever could. His death accomplished what no earthly high priest ever could. No more barriers, no more distance, no more waiting on a priest to enter God's presence for you. Now, you and I, anyone who believes in Jesus, can enter directly into the presence of God, not as strangers, not as outsiders, but as sons and daughters. The cross wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about access. For centuries, people had believed that God was distant, unreachable, hidden behind a veil. But in one moment, through one sacrifice, Jesus changed everything. He made a way where there was no way. He opened the door that had been shut for generations. And now, we don't need a priest to go before us. We don't need a temple to worship in. We don't need sacrifices to atone for our sins, because Jesus became all of that for us. What this means for you today. Right now, you might feel unworthy to come before God. You might feel like there's still a barrier between you and Him. But the truth, the veil is gone. God isn't distant anymore. He isn't waiting behind a wall for you to get your life together before you approach Him. He came to you. Through Jesus, you have access to the very presence of God, anytime, anywhere. All you have to do is come. The invitation is open. The way has been made. And it was written not in ink, but in the blood of the Lamb. But that was just the beginning. Because while the veil was tearing in the temple, something even more shocking was happening in the graveyards. Something that would leave the entire city of Jerusalem in shock. Because the next event, the dead began to rise. Number 2, the dead were raised to life. At first, it was just a low rumble, easily dismissed as aftershocks from the earthquake. But then tombs, sealed tombs, graves that had remained undisturbed for years, began to split open. And what happened next? No one was prepared for it, because bodies, real people, began to rise from the dead. What Matthew recorded, the Gospel of Matthew, captures this mind-blowing event. At that moment, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. The bodies of many holy people who had died were raised to life. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and went into the holy city and appeared to many people. Let that sink in. This wasn't a metaphor. This wasn't a vision. This was real. Actual graves opened, and real people who had been dead for years came back to life. And they didn't just stay near their tombs. They walked into the city. They were seen by many. Imagine the scene. Imagine the whispers in the marketplace. Did you hear? Someone saw old Elijah. He's alive. No, that's impossible. He's been dead for years. But then you turn around, and standing right there in the flesh is a face you never thought you'd see again. A relative, a friend, a prophet from generations past, and they are alive. What was happening? Some people must have thought it was the end of the world. Others must have dropped to their knees in terror. But those who truly understood the scriptures knew exactly what this meant. This was a sign that death itself had just been defeated, a foreshadowing of what was about to happen in just 3 days. Because these resurrections weren't just random miracles, they were declarations that Jesus' death was not the end. He had broken the power of the grave. Why did the graves open? For thousands of years, death had ruled over humanity like an unshakable tyrant. No one could escape it. No one could defeat it. Until now. Until Jesus. When Jesus died, the very ground shook, and death itself began to tremble. God was making a statement. This is not the end. Death does not have the final word anymore. The opening of the graves was like a crack in the prison of death, a preview of the full resurrection power that would be unleashed just days later. Because just like these saints had risen, Jesus himself was about to walk out of his own grave. What this means for us. Right now, when we look at a cemetery, it feels final. When we lose someone, it feels permanent. When we think about our own mortality, it feels unshakable. But this moment, the moment when graves broke open, reminds us that death does not win. Because Jesus didn't just rise from the dead for himself. He rose to prove that death has no final say over those who belong to him. And this is his promise. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. John 11, verse 25. If you believe in Jesus, then your grave is not your final destination. Because one day, at the sound of his voice, all graves will be emptied. One day, death itself will be swallowed up in victory. And this moment, the moment graves opened when Jesus died, was just the beginning. The greatest resurrection was still coming. For now, Jesus lay in a tomb, and the world thought he was gone forever. But while the world was grieving, God was already at work, because the story wasn't over yet. And while some were beginning to see the truth, one man, a hardened Roman soldier who had just put Jesus to death, was about to make a confession that would shake the world. Number 3, the centurion's confession. Truly, this was the Son of God. The Roman centurion was no ordinary soldier. He was a hardened warrior, a man who had seen countless men die. He had overseen crucifixions before, many of them. To him, this was just another execution, just another criminal hanging on a cross, or so he thought, because something about this man Jesus was different. And soon he would realize that this was no ordinary death. The soldier who killed Jesus. This centurion wasn't just any soldier. He was the one in charge, the one who had ordered the nails to be driven into Jesus' hands and feet, the one who had watched him suffer for hours, the one who had likely mocked him along with the others. He had heard the crowd laughing, shouting, "If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." He saved others, but he can't save himself. But Jesus, he didn't curse them. He didn't fight back. He didn't call down fire from heaven or beg for mercy. Instead, he prayed for them. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Who does that? Who prays for their killers in the middle of their own execution? Who speaks love instead of hatred, forgiveness instead of revenge? The centurion had seen many men die, but none like this. The sky turned black, and then came the darkness. At noon, the brightest part of the day, the sky suddenly went black. Not for a few seconds, not for a few minutes, but for 3 full hours. It was unnatural. It was terrifying, as if creation itself was mourning, as if something far greater was happening beyond what any human eye could see. Then, at 3 p.m., Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And with those words, he breathed his last. And at that very moment, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. A violent earthquake ripped through the land. The very rocks split apart. Tombs broke open. And inside the temple, though the centurion didn't know it yet, the massive veil had been torn in two. Something was happening, something supernatural, and the centurion felt it. The fear of God gripped him. He had stood at the foot of the cross for hours, watching this man die. He had seen his agony, his suffering, his last breath. And now he was standing on shaking ground, in complete darkness, surrounded by rumors of the dead rising. Everything inside him told him that this was no ordinary man. For the first time in his life, fear gripped his soul. Not fear of battle, not fear of death, but fear of God himself. And as he stared up at the lifeless body of the man he had just crucified, the words escaped his lips before he could stop them. Truly, this man was the Son of God. Matthew 27, the first confession from a Roman soldier. Let that sink in. The first public confession of Jesus' divine identity after his death did not come from a disciple, did not come from a Jewish priest, did not come from one of his followers. It came from a Roman executioner, the very man who had been part of his crucifixion. Think about that. The first person to see the truth was one of the very men responsible for his death. This wasn't a religious leader. This wasn't someone who had followed Jesus for years. This was a Gentile soldier, a man raised in pagan Rome, a man who had never cared about the Jewish Messiah. And yet, in that moment, he saw the truth. Why this matters. The centurion's confession was more than just a statement. It was a declaration, a fulfillment of what Jesus had been saying all along, that his death wasn't just for Israel. It wasn't just for the religious elite. It wasn't just for those who had already believed in him. It was for the world, even for his enemies, even for the very ones who crucified him. This moment was a preview of what was coming, that the gospel would not stay in Israel. It would go to the Gentiles, to the Romans, to every nation on earth. And it started with one soldier standing at the foot of the cross, realizing he had just killed the Son of God. What this means for you. If a hardened Roman executioner could see the truth about Jesus, then so can you. If a man who drove nails into his hands could come to believe in him, then no one is too far gone. Not you, not your family, not your friends. No one is beyond the reach of his grace. Jesus didn't die just for the religious. He died for the lost, the broken, the outcast, the doubters, the ones who never thought they'd believe. And just like that centurion, when you encounter the truth about Jesus, you can't ignore it. You have to make a choice, to either walk away or to believe. The centurion believed. Will you? But this wasn't the end. Because while the centurion was making his confession, Jesus' followers were nowhere to be found. They weren't boldly proclaiming the truth. They weren't standing strong in faith. They were scattered, afraid, and in complete despair. Number 4, Jesus' followers were scattered, confused, and afraid. The world had just witnessed the most extraordinary death in history. The sky had turned black. The earth had shaken. The temple veil had been torn. Graves had split open. Even a Roman centurion had confessed, truly, this man was the Son of God. And yet, where were Jesus' followers? They were nowhere to be found. For 3 years, these men had walked beside Jesus. They had seen miracles that defied nature. They had watched as he healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, and raised the dead. They had heard him calm a storm with just his voice. They had believed he was the Messiah. They had left everything to follow him. And yet, when the moment came to stand by him, they ran. The fear that took over Peter, the one who had sworn, even if I have to die with you, I will never deny you. Matthew 26:35, had denied even knowing Jesus. Not once, not twice, 3 times. When the soldiers came to arrest Jesus, the disciples fled into the night. Now, with Jesus dead and buried, they were hiding in fear, locked in a room, afraid they might be next. Everything they had believed in shattered. Everything they had hoped for buried in a tomb. The silence of Saturday. The day after the crucifixion must have been the longest, darkest day of their lives. No miracles, no signs, no hope, just silence. Have you ever had a moment where it felt like God had abandoned you, where you prayed for an answer and got nothing? That's what they felt. Except for them, it wasn't just a moment of doubt. It was the man they had trusted with their lives, now lying lifeless in a tomb. Had they been wrong? Had he failed? Was it all over? This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Messiahs don't die. Saviors don't get buried. This wasn't the plan. They thought he would overthrow Rome. They thought he would set up his kingdom on earth. But instead, he was dead. And with him, their hope had died too. When God feels absent, we look at the disciples and wonder how they could doubt. How could they not remember what Jesus said? How could they not trust that he would rise? But let's be honest. Haven't we all been there? Haven't we all faced moments of fear, of doubt, of feeling like God isn't there? When we don't understand why things happen the way they did, when the future looks uncertain, that's where they were. Afraid, confused, and hiding behind locked doors. But even in their fear, even in their doubt, God was still at work. Because while they sat in silence, heaven was preparing for a moment that would change history forever. Because the truth, the story wasn't over. Fear would soon turn to faith. What the disciples didn't know was that their darkest moment was about to be transformed into the greatest victory the world had ever seen. They thought they had lost him forever, but in just a few days, they would see him again. Their sorrow would turn to joy, their fear would turn to courage, and their doubt would turn to unshakable faith. Because while the world thought it was over, Jesus was about to rise, and the first sign of his resurrection would happen inside a sealed tomb guarded by Roman soldiers. Up next, the resurrection was already in motion. For now, Jesus' body lay cold and lifeless in the tomb. A massive stone sealed the entrance. Roman soldiers stood guard to make sure no one stole his body. The religious leaders were confident that they had won. But what they didn't know was that nothing could stop what was coming next. Because while the disciples were hiding in fear, heaven was already moving, and death itself was about to lose its grip. Number 5, the resurrection was already in motion. The world thought it was over. Jesus was dead. His body had been taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen, and placed in a cold, dark tomb. A massive stone, too heavy for any single person to move, was rolled across the entrance. And just to make sure no one dared to steal the body, the religious leaders went to Pilate and demanded that the tomb be sealed and guarded by Roman soldiers. "Sir," they said, "we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the 3rd day." Matthew 27:63-64. They feared a hoax. They thought the disciples might try to fake a resurrection. But what they didn't understand, what no one understood, was that Jesus didn't need his disciples to roll away the stone. Because even in the silence of the tomb, even as the guards stood watch, even as the world thought it was over, heaven was already moving. Something was happening in the unseen realm. To the human eye, the story looked finished. But in the spiritual realm, something earth-shattering was taking place. Because the Bible tells us in 1 Peter 3:18-19 that Jesus went and proclaimed victory to the spirits in prison. What does that mean? It means that while his body lay in the grave, his spirit was declaring victory over sin, over Satan, over death itself. For thousands of years, death had ruled over humanity like a tyrant. Every king, every prophet, every ordinary man and woman who had ever lived had fallen to its power until now. Because when Jesus stepped into death, death itself began to break apart. The enemy thought he had won. But in reality, the king was on the move. The guards had no idea what was coming. For the Roman soldiers stationed outside the tomb, this was just another assignment, just another dead body, just another day guarding a grave. They had no idea that they were about to witness the single most powerful moment in history. Because while the world slept in sorrow, while the disciples hid in fear, while the religious leaders celebrated their false victory, the first light of resurrection morning was about to break, and nothing could stop it. Not the Roman guards, not the massive stone, not even death itself. The stone was rolled away. The Bible tells us in Matthew 28:2, "Suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, rolled aside the stone, and sat on it." Can you picture it? An earthquake shakes the ground. The guards, the same men who had crucified Jesus, are thrown to the ground in terror. And from heaven itself, an angel descends. With a single movement, he rolls back the stone, not so that Jesus could get out, but so that the world could see he was already gone. The empty tomb. Moments later, Mary Magdalene and the other women arrived at the tomb. They had come to anoint his body with spices, to perform one final act of love. But instead of finding his lifeless body, they found an empty grave and an angel waiting for them, saying, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here. He has risen, just as he said." Let those words sink in. He is not here because death could not hold him, because sin had been defeated, because he is alive. The moment that changed everything. This was the moment that turned fear into faith, the moment that transformed weeping into joy, the moment that broke the curse of sin and death forever. Jesus wasn't just resuscitated. He wasn't just brought back to life for a little while. He was resurrected in glory, never to die again. The grave that had claimed every human being in history could not claim him. And because of that, it cannot claim us either. What this means for you, this isn't just a story from the past. It's a reality for today. The same power that raised Jesus from the dead lives in you. Because his resurrection wasn't just for himself, it was for you. It was to break every chain that holds you captive, to overcome every fear, every doubt, every sin, and every grave, to prove that death does not have the final say, that your past does not define you, that your failures do not define you, that because he lives, you can live too, forever. The story didn't end in the tomb. The resurrection was just the beginning. Jesus didn't rise from the grave and disappear. No, he appeared to his followers, proving beyond doubt that he was alive. He walked with them. He talked with them. He ate with them. He gave them a mission, and then he ascended to heaven, promising that one day he would return. And that, until that day, his power would live in us. What happens next? What Jesus did after his resurrection was just as important as what he did before his death. He appeared to his disciples, to his followers, to over 500 people at once. He proved that he wasn't a ghost, a vision, or a spirit, but the risen Son of God in flesh and blood. And then he gave them a mission that would change the world, a mission that now belongs to us, because this story is still being written. The same Jesus who walked out of the grave is calling you today. So here's the question. Will you believe? Because the truth is, he is alive. He is still moving, and he is still changing lives, even now, even yours. Conclusion, the story isn't over. Everything had changed. The veil was torn, signifying that the barrier between God and man was gone. The graves had broken open, declaring that death itself had lost its grip. A Roman soldier had confessed, proving that even the hardest of hearts could see the truth. The disciples, who had once been terrified and scattered, were about to become the boldest voices the world had ever heard. And now the tomb was empty. Jesus was alive. This was not the end, it was the beginning. For thousands of years, death had been undefeated. But in one moment, through one sacrifice, the enemy had been overthrown. And Jesus didn't just rise for himself, he rose for us. He rose to show that sin has no hold on you, that shame has no hold on you, that your past does not define you, that even in your darkest moment, God is still at work. Because if the greatest tragedy in history, the death of the Son of God, could lead to the greatest victory in eternity, then what do you think he can do in your life? What does this mean for you? Right now, you might feel far from God. Maybe you feel unworthy. Maybe you feel like your past is too broken, like you've made too many mistakes. But the truth is, the veil is gone. God is not waiting for you to clean yourself up before you approach him. He is waiting for you to come as you are. Because the tomb is empty, because the grave is defeated, and the same power that raised Jesus from the dead is the same power that can bring new life to you. The invitation is open. The message of the cross is not just about what happened back then. It's about what is happening now. Right now, Jesus is still calling people out of their graves. Right now, he is still forgiving sinners. Right now, he is still bringing dead things back to life. And right now, he is calling you. What will you do with this truth? This isn't just another story. This is your story. And now, you have a choice. You can walk away and say, that was interesting, or you can choose to believe that this changes everything, because it does. And if you've never made that choice before, if you've never truly believed, if you've never let Jesus into your life, then this is your moment. Because he lives, you can too. You don't have to live in fear anymore. You don't have to live in shame anymore. You don't have to live separated from God anymore. Because of Jesus, you can have eternal life. Because of Jesus, you can have freedom. Because of Jesus, you can have hope that never dies. And one day, when this life is over and you stand before him face to face, you will not hear words of judgment or condemnation. You will hear him say your name, and you will step into eternity, not as a stranger, not as an outsider, but as a child of God, forever. The greatest story is still being written. The resurrection wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of the greatest movement in history, a movement that you are now a part of. Because Jesus is not just a figure of the past, he is alive, he is moving, and he is still changing lives, even now, even yours. So the only question left is, will you believe? Because the tomb is empty, and that changes everything. Final words. This is your moment. If you're watching this and you feel something stirring inside you, that's not just emotion, that's not just excitement, that's God calling you. Because this story, his story, was always meant to become your story. So if you're ready to say yes to Jesus, if you're ready to step into new life, then don't wait. Because the same Jesus who walked out of the tomb 2,000 years ago is calling you today. And all you have to do is believe. This is just the beginning. The story of Jesus didn't end at the cross. It didn't end in the tomb. It is still being written in your life, in my life, and in every life that says yes to him. Because Jesus is not just the God of the past. He is the God of right now. And he is waiting for you. So now you have a choice. Will you walk away unchanged? Or will you believe that this story is your story too? Because he lives, so can you.